In the opening years of the 20th century, Europe stood on a fault line, beneath the veneer of diplomatic courtesy, a complex tapestry of rivalries, ambitions, and resentments pulsed with tension. Old empires creaked under internal strains, new nations demanded justice, and war, long thought obsolete, lurked just beyond the horizon. By 1900, the major powers, Britain, France, Germany, Austria-Hungary, Russia, and Italy, had fashioned a delicate balance of power. Across Europe, armies grew larger, generals sharpened strategies, and diplomats whispered in dark corridors. The belief that war was a failure of statesmanship, not an inevitability, was already dying. One of the first specters haunting Europe was nationalism. In the Balkans, Slavic peoples within the Austrian and Ottoman empires longed for autonomy or union with Serbia. Serbia, a small but ambitious kingdom, saw itself as the champion of Slavic liberation in the region. Austria-Hungary, a multinational empire struggling to hold itself together, viewed that nationalism as poison within its own borders. Meanwhile, imperial competition and colonial rivalries stretched the powers across the globe. Germany sought its place in the sun. Britain, the world's naval superpower, jealously guarded its dominance at sea. France nursed grievances since the loss in the Franco-Prussian War. Russia, vast and restless, cast a watchful eye toward the Balkans and the Straits. Tensions over Morocco, naval races, and colonial boundaries created flashpoints between France, Britain, and Germany. At the same time, alliances hardened. The Triple Alliance bound Germany, Austria-Hungary, and Italy. The Triple Entente drew Britain, France, and Russia into a loose, but increasingly rigid understanding. Each power calculated that with allies at its back, it could deter aggression, or, if necessary, wage war. But such calculations rested on assumptions of fast victory and limited scope. Behind the scenes, a military arms race unfolded. Battleships, dreadnoughts, heavy artillery, rifles, and the modernization of rail networks became tools of national might. Germany's naval buildup challenged Britain's supremacy. In the east, Russia expanded its army and rail lines. Austria-Hungary tinkered with reform and modernization. Each competitor watched the others, uncertain, anxious. In the Balkans, crises blossomed. The 1908 Bosnian annexation by Austria-Hungary, the Balkan Wars of 1912-13, and successive revolts deepened mutual suspicion. Serbia rose in prominence, loathing Austrian influence and seeking its own expansion. Russia viewed itself as protector of Slavic interests. Germany backed Austria-Hungary. France and Russia nurtured alliances and promises. Then, on a June morning in 1914, spark came. In Sarajevo, Bosnia, Archduke Franz Ferdinand, heir to the Austrian throne, and his wife Sophie rode through the city in an open car. Gavrilo Princip, a Bosnian Serb nationalist associated with the group Young Bosnia, fired 2 shots. The assassination stunned Europe. What was local violence in Sarajevo would erupt into world war. Austria-Hungary, backed by Germany in what became the blank check, presented an ultimatum to Serbia with harsh demands. Serbia accepted many but not all. Negotiations faltered. Mobilizations followed. Austria declared war on Serbia. Russia, pledging protection to Serbia, began mobilization. Germany declared war on Russia, then on Russia's ally France. It activated the Schlieffen Plan, invasion through Belgium. Britain, bound by treaties and by outrage at Belgium's neutrality, joined. The war had begun. In just days, the continent split. What had been a simmering crisis had transformed into a cascade of declarations and mobilizations. The world's steelworks roared into action, and machines of war stirred to life. Thus, what began as a local act in Sarajevo became a European, and then global conflagration. In the weeks ahead, armies would cross borders, trenches would carve the landscape, and millions would be swept into conflict on a scale never before imagined. Europe had sleepwalked into catastrophe. By late July 1914, the crisis that began in Sarajevo had spiraled into unstoppable momentum. Mobilization orders were issued, railway timetables activated, and the machinery of war clanked into motion. Each nation convinced itself that it was acting in self-defense. Each believed that the war would be over by Christmas. Across Europe, crowds filled the streets, not with fear, but with celebration. Flags waved, brass bands played patriotic songs, and young men lined up at recruiting offices. "It'll be a short war," many said. "We'll be home before the leaves fall." They could not have been more wrong. Germany's war plan, long prepared under General Alfred von Schlieffen, was audacious. It aimed to defeat France quickly in the west, then turn east to confront Russia's slower mobilizing armies. The German army would sweep through neutral Belgium, encircle Paris from the north, and crush France in 6 weeks. But plans on paper rarely survive contact with reality. On August 4th, 1914, German troops crossed the Belgian border. The violation of Belgium's neutrality shocked the world. Britain, bound by treaty and honor, declared war on Germany that same day. The Western Front was born. In Belgium, the German advance met unexpected resistance. At Liège, Belgian forts held out for days, delaying the timetable. The German army retaliated harshly. Towns were burned, civilians executed, acts that horrified the international community and became fuel for Allied propaganda. Meanwhile, the French army, guided by Plan 17, launched bold offensives into Alsace and Lorraine. Dressed in bright red trousers and blue coats, French soldiers marched with courage, but little protection against machine gun fire. The assaults were disastrous. Tens of thousands fell within days. The age of colorful uniforms and romantic battle had ended. Modern war had arrived. By late August, the German army had pushed deep into France. Paris prepared for siege. Refugees clogged the roads, carrying what they could as horse-drawn wagons mixed with retreating soldiers. The government moved to Bordeaux. Panic loomed. Then came a miracle. Outside Paris, on the banks of the Marne River, French and British forces regrouped. General Joseph Joffre, calm and resolute, ordered a counterattack. From September 6th to 12th, the first battle of the Marne raged. Taxicabs from Paris were requisitioned to ferry soldiers to the front, a symbol of the desperate defense. After fierce fighting, the German advance was halted. Exhausted, the Germans retreated to more defensible positions. The Schlieffen plan had failed. What followed was a frantic scramble northward, the so-called race to the sea. Each side tried to outflank the other, moving up through northern France and into Flanders. But every attempt ended in stalemate. Trenches were dug, defenses strengthened. From the North Sea to the Swiss border, a continuous line of trenches snaked across Europe. The age of movement had ended. The age of mud, barbed wire, and attrition had begun. On the Eastern Front, war unfolded differently. Vast distances allowed maneuver. Russia struck into East Prussia, forcing Germany to divert troops. At Tannenberg, in late August 1914, the German generals Hindenburg and Ludendorff annihilated a Russian army, capturing over 90,000 men. In the east, victories were grand but costly. In the west, stalemate grew. Back in Britain, volunteers poured into the new army, Kitchener's men. Posters urged them to join before it was too late. Across Europe, families watched their sons vanish into the meat grinder of war. Autumn 1914 brought the first Battle of Ypres. It was the last major attempt to break through before winter. The fighting was hellish, villages erased, artillery roaring day and night. Fields churned into mud. By November, the front froze. Neither side could advance, and both had suffered catastrophic losses. The first trenches appeared as temporary shelters, shallow pits dug for protection. But as weeks turned to months, they deepened, connected, and fortified. Men reinforced them with sandbags, timber, and corrugated iron. Soon, Entire underground worlds emerged. Dugouts, command posts, latrines, kitchens, even small chapels. Rats thrived. The smell of decay clung to everything. Artillery dominated the battlefield. Shells thundered relentlessly. Men lived beneath a sky that never stopped exploding. Snipers waited patiently for movement. Nights were lit by flares. Days vanished in the fog of cordite. By Christmas 1914, both sides were exhausted. Then, something extraordinary happened. On Christmas Eve, along sections of the Western Front, soldiers began to sing carols across no man's land. The songs drifted through the cold air. Still night. Silent night. By morning, men emerged from trenches, cautiously at first, then openly. They exchanged gifts, cigarettes, buttons, chocolate, and shook hands. For a few brief hours, enemies became men again. The Christmas truce was never repeated on such a scale, but it revealed something profound, that beneath the uniforms and flags, the soldiers shared the same weariness, the same longing for home. When orders came to resume fighting, they obeyed. The guns spoke again, and the war continued. By the end of 1914, the conflict had already consumed millions. The optimism of August had vanished, replaced by disbelief. The war everyone thought would be short had become a war of endurance. The world had entered a new kind of nightmare. By the winter of 1914, the war had become a siege without end. Across northern France and Belgium, men lived in narrow ditches carved through mud and clay. The front line, the support line, the reserve. Between them stretched the wasteland the soldiers called no man's land, a shattered world of shell holes, barbed wire, and corpses frozen where they fell. The trench was not a place, it was a condition. Men slept ankle-deep in mud, their clothes soaked, their skin blistered with lice. Rats fed on unburied dead. The stench of rot and cordite clung to everything. Letters from home arrived damp and smudged. Photographs of loved ones pinned beside rifles and gas masks. Every dawn brought the same ritual. Stand to. Bayonets fixed, eyes scanning the mist for movement. Artillery never ceased. The ground trembled like a living thing. And when orders came to go over the top, men climbed ladders into hell. Verdun, 1916, the furnace of France. In February 1916, the German army launched a massive offensive against the fortress city of Verdun. General Falkenhayn, the German commander, believed he could bleed France white. Verdun, he said, was not to be captured but to be destroyed, a place where France would pour out her lifeblood defending it. For 10 months, the battle raged. Hills and villages changed hands dozens of times. Forts Douaumont and Vaux were smashed by artillery. Entire forests vanished beneath shellfire. The air was filled with the metallic scream of shells, millions of them. The French rallied around a single phrase: "Ils ne passeront pas." They shall not pass. General Pétain became a national hero, his soldiers enduring under constant fire. In the end, Verdun devoured more than 700,000 men, killed, wounded, or missing, for a few square miles of ground. The landscape, even today, still bears the scars. The Somme, 1916, the price of breakthrough. While Verdun burned, Britain prepared a great offensive along the river Somme. The goal was to relieve pressure on the French and finally break the deadlock. At 7:30 a.m. on July 1st, 1916, whistles blew and thousands of men went over the top. They believed the German defenses had been shattered by a week-long artillery barrage. They were wrong. The bombardment had failed to cut the wire or destroy the bunkers. As British troops advanced in neat lines across open fields, German machine guns opened up. In a single day, nearly 60,000 British soldiers were killed or wounded, the worst day in the history of the British Army. For months, the battle dragged on. The first tanks rolled into action, lumbering, unreliable, terrifying. The skies above filled with fragile biplanes locked in duels among the clouds. Artillery thundered without pause. When the Somme finally ended in November, more than 1 million men had fallen, for barely 6 miles of ground. The Western Front had become a slaughterhouse. New weapons, new horrors. Technology reshaped the war. In April 1915, at Ypres, the Germans released chlorine gas, the first large-scale use of poison gas. A green cloud drifted across the trenches, burning lungs, blinding eyes, suffocating men. Soon both sides developed new agents: phosgene, mustard gas, tear gas. Gas masks became as vital as rifles. Above, the skies grew crowded. Observation balloons and aircraft scouted enemy lines. Pilots became the new knights of war. Their duels romanticized, their lifespans brief. Names like Manfred von Richthofen, the Red Baron, entered legend. At sea, German U-boats prowled the Atlantic, striking civilian and military ships alike. The sinking of the Lusitania in 1915 shocked the world, foreshadowing a new, total form of warfare. Life in the trenches. Between offensives, soldiers endured monotony broken by terror. Letters home, a tin of bully beef, a moment's smoke, small comforts in an endless nightmare. Comradeship became a lifeline. Humor, dark and bitter, helped men survive. They gave ironic names to their trenches. Suicide Corner, The Dump, Happy Valley. Rain turned everything to mud. Winter froze it solid. When the guns fell silent, a strange quiet descended, broken only by the whimper of the wounded in no man's land. Night patrols crept through the wire, scavenging, listening for enemy digging. The front line was a living, breathing organism, dangerous even in stillness. Behind the front, generals planned new offensives. The soldiers waited, knowing that the next whistle might be their last. A war without end. By late 1916, both sides were exhausted but unbroken. The casualty lists grew longer than anyone had imagined possible. Families in every town and village read the names of sons who would never return. Yet still, the orders came. Hold the line, prepare for spring. The Western Front had settled into its grim rhythm. Attack, counterattack, shelling, repair. The world watched as civilization seemed to devour itself. What had begun as a crisis of honor was now a test of endurance. A war not of movement, but of will. And as 1917 approached, new powers and new revolutions would change the course of history once again. While the trenches of France swallowed armies whole, the war's shadow stretched far beyond Europe. It reached across oceans, deserts, and jungles, to colonies and kingdoms that had never seen a European battlefield. From India to Egypt, from South Africa to the Pacific Islands, millions were drawn into a war they did not start. The call of empire. When war broke out in 1914, the great powers of Europe ruled over half the planet. Britain alone governed a quarter of the world's people. Its colonies supplied troops, raw materials, and money, and they did so without question at first. In India, princes pledged men and treasure to the king emperor. In Africa, colonial governors raised regiments from native populations, often through coercion or promises that would never be kept. From Canada, Australia, and New Zealand, volunteers rushed to defend what they still called the mother country. More than 2.5 million soldiers from the British Empire would fight in the war. Nearly half of them came from India, Africa's forgotten battlefields. In the scrublands and jungles of Africa, the war took a different form, one of long marches, hunger, and disease. In German East Africa, today's Tanzania, General Paul von Lettoverbeck led a guerrilla campaign that tied down British, Belgian, and Portuguese forces for 4 long years. His troops, mostly African Askari soldiers, outmaneuvered larger enemy armies, surviving on captured supplies and sheer discipline. By the time news of the armistice reached him, von Lettoverbeck had never been defeated in the field. In West Africa, battles were fought over colonies like Togoland and Cameroon. The fighting was brutal and forgotten. Thousands of Africans died not in trenches, but of malaria, dysentery, and starvation. For many of them, there were no medals, no memorials, only silence. The Middle Eastern theater. To the east, the Ottoman Empire joined the war on Germany's side, and soon, the sands of Arabia and the hills of Gallipoli became new front lines. The Gallipoli campaign in 1915 aimed to knock the Ottomans out of the war by capturing the Dardanelles. It was a disaster. British, French, Australian, and New Zealand troops landed on steep, fortified beaches and faced months of slaughter under relentless Turkish fire. By the time they withdrew, more than 250,000 Allied soldiers were dead or wounded. Yet, from that defeat came legend, especially for the Anzacs, whose courage under fire became part of their national identity. Farther south, a quiet revolt was brewing. The British, desperate to undermine Ottoman rule, promised Arab leaders independence in exchange for rebellion. Figures like Lawrence of Arabia, rode alongside Bedouin tribes, capturing key cities and railways. But the promises made in the desert would later be broken in the peace treaties, replaced by foreign mandates and resentment that echo even today. Asia and the Pacific. In Asia, Japan, allied with Britain, seized German colonies in China and the Pacific. The Japanese Navy escorted Allied convoys, hunted U-boats, and took control of islands that would later become crucial in the Second World War. In China, tens of thousands of laborers were shipped to the Western Front, the Chinese Labor Corps, to dig trenches, build roads, and clear battlefields. Most were never mentioned in history books, but their work sustained armies at the edge of collapse. A war that changed loyalty. For colonial soldiers, the war was both duty and awakening. They had fought for empires that saw them as subjects, not equals. They had seen the civilized nations of Europe tear each other apart. When the war ended, many returned home changed, questioning the justice of empire and dreaming of self-rule. In India, the war's aftermath would fuel a new generation of leaders, men like Mahatma Gandhi, who began demanding freedom, not favor. In Africa and the Middle East, the same seeds of independence began to grow. The Great War had bound the world together, but it had also set the stage for its unraveling. By 1915, the war no longer belonged only to soldiers and generals. It belonged to the engineers, the chemists, the inventors, men who built machines capable of killing on an industrial scale. The battlefields of Europe became laboratories where technology evolved faster than morality. The age of artillery. The sound of the Great War was not the rattle of rifles, but the thunder of guns. Field artillery had grown enormous, howitzers that could hurl shells the weight of cars across 10 miles. At Verdun alone, the French and Germans fired more than 60 million shells in 10 months. Entire forests disappeared. Villages were ground into gray dust. Shell shock, the invisible wound, was born here, where constant bombardment shattered not only earth, but minds. Poison gas. Then came a weapon the world had never imagined. In April 1915, at Ypres, a greenish cloud drifted across no man's land. The Germans had opened canisters of chlorine gas. Men coughed, clawed at their throats, and died where they stood. Soon every army developed its own chemical agents, phosgene, mustard, tear gas, each more horrifying than the last. Masks became standard issue, but no mask could stop fear. The wind itself had become the enemy. War in the air. Above the trenches, another revolution unfolded. At first, planes were little more than scouts, fragile frames of wood and canvas. Pilots waved to each other across the sky. But soon, they carried pistols. Then machine guns bolted to the fuselage. By 1916, aerial duels filled the skies. The press called the aces heroes. Manfred von Richthofen, the Red Baron, whose crimson Fokker triplane became a symbol of terror. Britain's Edward Manock and Albert Ball, France's Georges Guynemer. Dogfights turned war into spectacle, but for every celebrated ace, dozens vanished into clouds, never to return. Air power had been born, and the world would never again fight without it. The tanks roll in. Back on the ground, stalemate demanded a miracle. The British found one in the invention of the tank, a machine that could crawl over trenches, crush wire, and shrug off bullets. When they first appeared at the Battle of the Somme in 1916, the sight was astonishing. Metal beasts moving through smoke and mud. Early tanks were slow, unreliable, and stiflingly hot inside, but they terrified enemy troops. By 1918, thousands rumbled across the front, often in coordination with aircraft and artillery. For the first time, mobility returned to the battlefield. The tank was the future, one that generals would spend the next century mastering. War at sea. Beneath the waves, another kind of warfare thrived. Germany's U-boats stalked the Atlantic, sinking merchant convoys without warning. Britain answered with convoys, sonar, and depth charges, new technologies born overnight. Meanwhile, the great dreadnought fleets, steel leviathans, waited for a decisive clash that never truly came. Only once did they meet in force. Jutland, 1916. It ended in confusion and smoke, both sides claiming victory, neither gaining control of the seas. Still, the blockade starved Germany, proving that strategy could starve a nation more effectively than bullets. Communication and control. Behind every gun and engine was a network of invisible innovation. Telephones linked trenches to headquarters. Telegraphs pulsed orders across continents. The first radio transmitters guided ships and planes. Pigeons carried vital messages when wires were cut. One Cher Army delivered its note while bleeding from a bullet wound, saving nearly 200 trapped soldiers. Even photography evolved. Aerial cameras mapped enemy lines. Portable motion picture units recorded propaganda reels. For the first time, war could be seen as it happened. The industrial front. Factories became as crucial as battlefields. Entire economies turned into engines of war. Women riveted, welded, and packed shells. Children gathered scrap metal. Chemists invented synthetic rubber, fuel, and nitrates when natural supplies ran dry. Modern warfare meant total mobilization. Every citizen part of the machine. The cost of innovation. Every breakthrough came at a human price. The same science that built tanks also built gas shells. The same factories that forged victory also erased cities. The Great War had shown humanity its own genius and its capacity for self-destruction. When it ended, no nation could return to the old ways. The tools of 1918 were the blueprints of the century to come. By 1916, the Great War was not only a clash of armies. It was a clash of stories, a war of words, of symbols, of what people believed. Governments had learned a new lesson. In a modern war, it was not enough to fight the enemy soldiers. You had to control the minds of your own. The birth of propaganda. Every major power built new offices devoted to persuasion. Britain called it the War Propaganda Bureau. Germany had its central office for foreign service. France, Italy, and even the United States soon followed. Artists, writers, and filmmakers were recruited as soldiers of the imagination. They painted posters, wrote stirring pamphlets, filmed heroic reels, all designed to turn fear into faith. On walls and street corners, posters urged sacrifice. A British once showed Lord Kitchener pointing, "Your country needs you." In America, Uncle Sam echoed the same command. In France, Marion stood in armor. In Germany, the Iron Cross gleamed. Each nation promised its people the same thing, that their cause was noble, their victory inevitable. Censorship and control. But truth, like food, was rationed. Letters from the front were read and censored. Newspapers printed only what the government allowed. Journalists who questioned the war effort were branded as traitors. In Britain, stories of defeat were hidden. In Germany, hardship was called endurance. Each side accused the other of barbarism, of atrocities, some true, others invented. Censorship was not merely political, it was emotional. Families back home were shielded from the worst realities. The stench of corpses, the screams in the mud. For many, the shock came only when soldiers finally returned. Songs of the soldiers. Still, not all propaganda came from above. On both sides, soldiers made their own songs, sometimes proud, sometimes bitter. The British sang, "It's a long way to Tipperary," as they marched. The Germans hummed Die Wacht im Rhein. By 1917, the tone had changed. New songs whispered disillusionment, gallows humor to survive the unthinkable. One British trench tune went, "We're here because we're here, because we're here, because we're here." A circle of irony, sung to the tune of Auld Lang Syne. Propaganda inspired faith. Music helped men endure doubt. Espionage, the invisible war. Beyond the posters and songs lay a darker struggle. A world of shadows and secrets, spies, saboteurs, and double agents. The most famous was Mata Hari, the exotic dancer who moved between the salons of Europe, trading secrets for money and survival. Accused of espionage by the French, she was executed by firing squad in 1917, her legend outliving the truth. Real spies were far less glamorous. They tapped telegraph lines, forged documents, and smuggled intelligence across borders. The British created Room 40, their cryptographic unit, which intercepted and decoded the Zimmermann telegram, the message that would help bring America into the war. Information, once just a tool, had become a weapon. The war on the home front. The home front was a battlefield of another kind. Governments managed not only weapons, but emotions. They rallied citizens with parades and patriotic drives, and silenced dissent with laws and fear. In Britain, the Defense of the Realm Act gave sweeping powers to detain or censor anyone who questioned the war. In the United States, the Espionage Act and Sedition Act did the same. Yet, the longer the war dragged on, the harder it became to sustain belief. Prices rose, wages froze, and families starved while propaganda still promised glory. Rumor spread faster than truth, and faith in leaders began to fracture. Women and the War of Perseverance. While men fought abroad, women fought at home, in factories, hospitals, and fields. Posters called them angels of the nation, yet their labor was anything but celestial. They filled shells, drove ambulances under fire, nursed the wounded, and buried the dead. In Britain, they were known as munitionettes, their skin tinted yellow from the chemicals and explosives. In France and Russia, women even took up arms, forming their own battalions when manpower ran dry. For many, the war brought liberation, a first taste of independence. But when peace came, the world would expect them to quietly return to silence. Some did not. Morale and madness. By 1917, both soldiers and civilians were running on the fumes of propaganda. Faith was thinning, hope was rationed. Rumors of mutiny, revolution, and defeat spread across Europe like a second contagion. In France, soldiers refused to attack. In Germany, workers struck. In Russia, the entire empire collapsed under the weight of hunger and lies. For every poster proclaiming victory, there was a mother staring at an empty doorway, wondering what all the slogans had been worth. The world learns to believe in doubt. The Great War changed not just how nations fought, but how they thought. It taught governments that control over information was as vital as control over guns. It taught people to question what they were told, and yet to crave meaning more than ever. Cinema, radio, and mass printing would carry those lessons into the next century, where every war would be fought not just on the battlefield, but in the mind. Epilogue: Truth in the Rubble. When the guns finally fell silent in 1918, the propaganda stopped too. The posters faded. The newspapers moved on. But the lies and hopes they carried lingered in every survivor's heart. One soldier wrote home. They told us we were fighting monsters, but the ones I met were just like us, tired, scared, and human. The war of words had ended, but its echoes would shape the peace that followed. While the trenches of France consumed the headlines, the Great War was never confined to the Western Front. It was a world war, fought across continents, oceans, and colonies. From the snows of Poland to the sands of Arabia, millions took up arms in battles far from home. The Eastern Front, war of movement and misery. In the East, the war looked different. Here, the front stretched for nearly 1,000 miles, from the Baltic Sea to the Black Sea. There were no continuous trenches, only shifting lines, vast distances, and brutal winters. In 1914, Russia had invaded East Prussia, hoping for a quick victory. But at Tannenberg, German generals Hindenburg and Ludendorff turned the tables. Using intercepted messages, they encircled the Russian Second Army and captured more than 90,000 men. It was a humiliating defeat that haunted Russia for years. But the Russian Empire could replace its losses for a time. Millions of peasants were conscripted. Supplies, however, were scarce. Soldiers marched barefoot through snow, rifles shared between men. Yet they fought on, driven by loyalty, fear, and endurance. By 1915, the Central Powers struck back. The Germans and Austrians launched the Gorlice, Tarnow offensive, smashing the Russian lines and forcing a retreat hundreds of miles east. Entire villages vanished beneath fire and famine. Refugees clogged the roads. The Tsar's government teetered under the weight of defeat. Amid the chaos, a sense of despair spread across Russia. Whispers of revolution began to grow. The Balkans, the powder keg reignited. Further south in the Balkans, the very cradle of the conflict, fighting flared once more. Serbia, small but fierce, had withstood Austria-Hungary's initial assault in 1914. But by late 1915, fresh German and Bulgarian forces attacked from all sides. Belgrade fell. The Serbian army, frozen and starving, retreated across the Albanian mountains to the Adriatic. Thousands died on the march. The survivors were evacuated to Corfu, then to the Salonika front in Greece, where a new Allied army formed. The Balkans became a theater of endurance, malaria, mud, and stalemate. But from there, years later, would come one of the war's final breakthroughs. Gallipoli, the Empire's gamble. Meanwhile, in 1915, the Allies sought a new front, a daring plan to knock the Ottoman Empire out of the war. The idea came from a young First Lord of the Admiralty, Winston Churchill. If the Allies could seize the Dardanelles Strait, they could link with Russia, open a new supply route, and perhaps end a stalemate in the West. The plan began with a naval assault on the Strait's forts, and failed. Undeterred, the Allies landed troops on the Gallipoli Peninsula in April 1915. British, French, Australian, and New Zealand forces, the Anzacs. They stormed the beaches under heavy fire and dug in on cliffs and ridges that offered no shelter. For 8 months, they fought the Turks, led by a resolute commander named Mustafa Kemal. The campaign became a nightmare of heat, disease, and futility. When the Allies finally withdrew in January 1916, more than 100,000 men were dead. Gallipoli became a symbol of courage, sacrifice, and the terrible cost of poor strategy. The Middle East revolted in the desert. Beyond the Dardanelles, another front burned, the deserts of Arabia. The Ottoman Empire, long called the sick man of Europe, had joined the Central Powers, stretching the conflict deep into the Middle East. In 1916, an Arab revolt erupted against Ottoman rule. Backed by Britain, Arab leaders like Sharif Hussein of Mecca sought independence for their lands. A young British officer, T. Lawrence, later known as Lawrence of Arabia, helped unite tribes and wage guerrilla war across the desert. They struck railways, ambushed garrisons, and seized the port of Aqaba. For the first time, camels, explosives, and modern rifles moved together across endless dunes. To the west, British forces advanced from Egypt into Palestine and Mesopotamia, modern Iraq. At Kut al-Amara, an entire British garrison surrendered after a siege, one of Britain's worst defeats. But in 1917, a new commander, General Allenby, captured Jerusalem, fulfilling a long-held ambition. Africa and the seas, the global war. Across Africa, the colonies of the European empires became battlefields. In German East Africa, a small force under General Paul von Lettow-Vorbeck fought a brilliant guerrilla campaign, tying down hundreds of thousands of Allied troops until the war's very end. African porters and soldiers endured unimaginable hardship, their contributions long overlooked by history. On the oceans, war raged without mercy. The British Navy blockaded Germany, strangling its economy. German U-boats retaliated, sinking merchant ships in the Atlantic. When the Lusitania went down in 1915, killing nearly 1,200, including Americans, the world shuddered. Submarine warfare would become one of the most controversial weapons of the age. The war in the skies. By 1916 and 1917, the air war had become an independent theater. Fighters clashed over the front lines. Bombers struck railways and factories. Pilots became celebrities, the aces. The Red Baron, Manfred von Richthofen, shot down over 80 aircraft before he was killed in 1918. But for every hero, hundreds of unknown airmen perished, their planes splintered in the clouds. A world in flames. From Europe to Africa, from Asia to the Pacific, the war consumed entire societies. India, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and the African colonies sent millions of men and vast resources to Europe's battlefields. The British Empire alone mobilized nearly 9 million soldiers. The French drew on troops from North Africa and Indochina. The Germans relied on their colonies and allies. Every corner of the globe was touched. By 1917, famine stalked the Central Powers. In Germany, food shortages sparked unrest. In Russia, revolution loomed. The old world order trembled on its foundations. The Great War was no longer just a conflict of armies. It had become a struggle of nations, economies, and ideas. And as the empires began to crumble, a new power waited across the Atlantic, preparing to enter the storm. By early 1917, the Great War had become a war of endurance, a struggle measured not in victories, but in survival. Europe was starving, the soldiers were weary, and the old empires stood on the edge of collapse. For more than 2 years, millions had fought without decisive result. Verdun, the Somme, Gallipoli, names carved in grief. Families lived on ration cards and telegrams. Fields once green with harvest were now graveyards of metal and bone. The dream of swift victory was long dead. The home fronts crack. The war reached into every home. Civilians were no longer bystanders. They were part of the machine. Factories thundered night and day. Women replacing men at the forges and assembly lines. Posters urged sacrifice. Governments censored news, silenced dissent, and rationed food. In Germany, the British blockade had begun to bite. Bread was mixed with sawdust. Meat disappeared from the tables. In Austria-Hungary, people queued for hours for a handful of potatoes. In Britain, Zeppelins drifted over London at night, dropping bombs that shattered roofs and confidence alike. Morale was fraying everywhere. Soldiers muttered. Workers struck. Politicians promised victory, but offered little hope. The Russian Revolution. Nowhere did the strain show more than in Russia. By 1917, the Russian army was collapsing. Millions dead, millions captured, supplies gone. The Tsar, Nicholas II, still believed in divine destiny, but his empire was rotting beneath him. Bread riots erupted in Petrograd. Soldiers refused to fire on the crowds. Within days, the Tsar was forced to abdicate. The Romanov dynasty, 3 centuries old, was gone. A provisional government took power, vowing to continue the war. But the soldiers wanted peace, the peasants wanted land, and the workers wanted food. Amid the chaos, a new voice rose, Vladimir Lenin and the Bolsheviks, promising peace, land, and bread. In October 1917, Lenin's followers seized power. The world watched in shock as Russia, once a cornerstone of the Allies, plunged into revolution. Within months, the new Bolshevik government signed the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk with Germany, surrendering vast territories to end its war. The Eastern Front fell silent, but it freed 500,000 German soldiers to march west. The clock was ticking for the Allies. Unrestricted submarine warfare. In desperation, Germany turned once again to the weapon that had nearly brought America into the war before, the U-boat. In February 1917, Germany declared the seas around Britain a war zone. Any ship, military or civilian, neutral or not, could be sunk without warning. They hoped to starve Britain into surrender before the United States could intervene. Merchant ships went down by the hundreds. Grain and munitions from across the Atlantic vanished beneath the waves. But Germany had miscalculated. Among the ships sunk were American vessels, and with every attack, outrage in the U.S. grew. Then came the Zimmermann telegram, a secret German proposal to Mexico, promising support if it attacked the United States. When the message was intercepted and revealed, it was the final insult. On April 6, 1917, the United States declared war on Germany. A sleeping giant had entered the conflict. America enters the war. At first, the U.S. had no large army ready for Europe, but its industrial power and manpower were immense. Under General John J. Pershing, the American Expeditionary Forces began to arrive in France in mid-1917. They were fresh, confident, and unbroken by the years of trench warfare. Their presence electrified the weary Allies and terrified Germany. Across the Atlantic, factories roared. Liberty bonds funded the war. Propaganda called it a fight to make the world safe for democracy. For the first time, the conflict truly became global, not only in geography, but in spirit, an ideological battle between autocracy and self-determination. 1917, the year of mutiny and despair. Yet 1917 was also the year of despair. At the front, soldiers' faith in their leaders crumbled. After the failed Nivelle offensive in France, tens of thousands of French troops mutinied. They refused to attack again, though they held their lines. General Pétain restored order not with executions alone, but with promises: better leave, better food, no more pointless assaults. In Britain, Prime Minister Asquith fell. Lloyd George rose to power, promising more efficient command. Still, the slaughter continued. In Italy, disaster struck at Caporetto, an Austro-German offensive that shattered the Italian army and sent it in retreat down the Alps. Everywhere, the sense of collapse loomed. And yet, despite exhaustion, the war machine rolled on. 1918, the final gamble. When Russia withdrew, Germany seized its last chance. In March 1918, they launched Operation Michael, a massive spring offensive on the Western Front. Using new stormtrooper tactics, the Germans broke through Allied lines, advancing farther in days than in the previous 3 years. Paris once again was threatened. Refugees fled. Allied leaders feared the end. But the Germans had advanced too fast. Their supply lines faltered, their soldiers, starving and exhausted, looted instead of fighting. Then, in July, the tide turned. Fresh American divisions entered the line at Château-Thierry and Belleau Wood, fighting with fierce determination. One German officer reportedly said, "The Americans are devils in battle." By August 1918, the German offensive had burned itself out. Now the Allies struck back, coordinated, relentless. British, French, Canadian, Australian, and American forces advanced in what became known as the 100 Days Offensive. Collapse from within. At home, Germany unraveled. Food riots erupted in cities. Workers struck in the munitions plants. The sailors of the High Seas Fleet, ordered to make a final suicidal attack, mutinied at Kiel. Revolution spread across the country. By November, Kaiser Wilhelm II fled into exile. Germany was leaderless, starving, and broken. In the early hours of November 11th, 1918, the guns finally fell silent. But that story, the armistice and the world left in its shadow, would come next. The end came quietly. No grand finale, no final charge, only silence. At 11 o'clock on the morning of November 11th, 1918, the guns that had thundered for 4 years stopped. Men looked up from their trenches in disbelief. Birds returned to skies long empty of song. Somewhere a clock struck 11, and across the Western Front, a strange calm spread. Not peace, but exhaustion. The armistice. The terms of the armistice had been signed hours earlier in a railway carriage in Compiègne Forest, north of Paris. Around a wooden table sat the victors and the defeated, Marshal Ferdinand Foch for the Allies, and a weary German delegation that knew their empire had already fallen apart. Germany was to surrender its weapons, withdraw its armies, and end the war unconditionally. The soldiers who heard the news hardly cheered. They were too tired to feel triumph. They had survived what millions had not. When the word reached Paris, London, and New York, crowds poured into the streets. Flags waved, bells rang, strangers embraced. In the cities, joy overflowed. In the villages, silence lingered, empty chairs, faded photographs, unopened letters. The cost of victory could be seen in every family. The world after war. For great empires had vanished. Germany, Austria-Hungary, Russia, and the Ottoman Empire. New nations rose from their ruins. Poland, Czechoslovakia, Yugoslavia, Finland, the Baltic states. For the first time, maps of Europe were redrawn not by monarchs, but by ideals, nationalism, self-determination, democracy. But these new borders carried old tensions. Peoples divided by language and faith found themselves bound inside fragile new countries. Across the continent, millions of displaced civilians wandered roads that led nowhere. In Russia, Civil war raged between Reds and Whites. In Central Europe, famine and influenza claimed millions more lives than the battlefield ever had. The Great War was over, but its shadow had only begun to fall. The Treaty of Versailles. In 1919, the victors gathered in Paris to shape the peace. The conference filled the grand halls of Versailles with diplomats, generals, and idealists. President Woodrow Wilson of the United States brought his vision of a League of Nations and a world safe for democracy. France's Georges Clemenceau demanded security and retribution. Britain's David Lloyd George balanced vengeance with pragmatism. Germany was excluded from the table. When the Treaty of Versailles was signed in June 1919, it imposed heavy reparations, territorial losses, and the so-called War Guilt Clause, declaring Germany solely responsible for the conflict. For many Germans, it was humiliation carved into law. The seeds of bitterness and resentment were sown, seeds that, in time, would grow into new catastrophe. The treaty redrew borders far beyond Europe. The Middle East was partitioned under British and French mandates. Africa's colonies changed hands. Japan expanded its reach in Asia. The world had been rearranged, but not healed. The human cost. The numbers defied comprehension. More than 9 million soldiers dead, 21 million wounded. Entire towns emptied of young men. Civilians suffered through famine, bombardment, and disease. The influenza pandemic of 1918 to 1919, the Spanish flu, swept across the globe, killing an estimated 50 million more. Every village square in Europe bore new memorials of stone and bronze. Every name etched upon them told a story unfinished. In Britain and France, a generation was lost. In Germany and Russia, revolutions reshaped society. Women who had filled factories and hospitals demanded the vote, and in many countries, they won it. Technology had advanced in 4 years more than in the previous 40. Tanks, airplanes, radio, medicine, all born of necessity and destruction. The League of Nations and the hope of peace. Despite the bitterness, there was hope. The League of Nations, Wilson's creation, promised a new era of diplomacy, a place where nations might settle disputes without war. It was an ideal born from horror, a belief that humanity could learn from its own suffering. But the United States, weary of foreign entanglements, refused to join. Without American support, the League struggled for authority. Still, for a moment, it stood as a symbol, proof that even in ruin, people could dream of something better. The lost generation. Writers, poets, and artists tried to make sense of what they had lived through. Eric Maria Remarque wrote All Quiet on the Western Front, capturing the disillusionment of an entire generation. Siegfried Sassoon and Wilfred Owen turned their trauma into verse, describing not glory, but mud, fear, and pity. Owen was killed just a week before the armistice, his final poem arriving home as the bells of peace rang out. Across the world, veterans returned to find societies changed beyond recognition. They carried the war inside them, in scars and silence, in memories they could never share. Legacy of the Great War. The First World War reshaped humanity. It ended monarchies, forged new nations, and introduced weapons capable of annihilation. It redrew borders, toppled empires, and changed how the world saw itself. It was called the War to End All Wars. Yet within 2 decades, the world would march again toward an even greater fire. Still, the men and women of 1914 to 1918 had witnessed both the worst and the best of humankind, courage amid terror, compassion amid ruin. Their letters, diaries, and memories remain as warnings and as testaments, not of glory, but of endurance. Epilogue. As night fell on November 11th, 1918, a British private wrote in his journal, "The silence was so sudden, so deep, it was almost frightening. We looked at each other and could hardly speak. We were alive, and we didn't quite know why." The Great War had ended. The modern world had begun. When the guns finally fell silent in 1918, the propaganda stopped too. The posters curled on the walls. The headlines changed. But the stories they told, the myths, the half-truths, the messages whispered through every home and trench, stayed behind. Governments had learned the power of persuasion. They had learned that a war could be won or lost, not only on the battlefield, but in the human mind. Those who survived would carry that lesson into the next decades, into revolutions, into ideologies, into another war that would make the first seem like a rehearsal. It isn't the end. In the next video, we'll go step by step inside the propaganda itself. How it was written, how it was spread, and how it turned nations into believers. If you've been following this journey through history, make sure you don't miss what comes next. Subscribe to the channel, turn on the notifications, and stay with us as we move deeper into the untold stories of the First World War. Step by step, moment by moment, every episode reveals another layer of how the world was changed forever.